It's happy to see so many faces. Welcome to the second session of our season 3 of Saturday with Scholar. Today we have the pleasure to host Professor Dr. Chandrava Chakravarty ma'am. And before I say anything, I would like to request our dearest Dean, Professor Dr. Shubir Dhar sir, to kindly felicitate our speaker. Thank you so much, sir. And everyone, before we begin, I would like to remind that please silent your mobile phone. And if you have any question or anything, I'm sure that ma'am would be happy to oblige that after the session. And without any further ado, I'd like to request sir again to say a few words about ma'am, and then we'll start the session.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's nice to see so many people in Disney once again. Doing one of our Saturday with a Scholar sessions. These sessions have been designed to give you a taste of the best scholarship available in Kolkata and sometimes outside Kolkata at the present moment. And today, I am very happy to be able to introduce to you Professor Chandrava Chakravarty of the West Bengal State University. I just want to tell her a little bit about her accomplishments because she happens to be one of the most, I would say, prominent scholars of her generation in Kolkata at this moment. Professor Chakravarty is a professor in the Department of English and the director of the Center for Studies in Gender, Culture and Media at the West Bengal State University, India. Her research interests include literature of the long 18th century, colonial Bengal, gender and culture studies, and a few of her notable publications are her monograph, Gendering the Nation, Identity, Politics and English Stage of the Long 18th Century, published by Orient Black Swan in 2013, and the edited volumes, The New Woman in Tagore, The Making and Unmaking of Female Subjectivity, which was a Sage publication 2017. Apart from that, she has published The King in Rabindranath Tagore's drama, Political Power Reinscribed in Raja, in The Politics of and Reception of Rabindranath Tagore's Drama, which is a Routledge publication from USA, which is 2015. She has also authored Babu Culture, The Garden and Garden House in Colonial Bengal, in a journal, Moving Worlds, a journal of transcultural writings, in volume 17 in 2017. And apart from that, she has also authored Connecting Hemispheres, Playing with Distance, Rammohan Roy, an Indian transnationalist, published in Hemisphere and Stratospheres, The Idea and the Experience of Distance in the Long 18th Century, published once again from USA in 2020. And her latest publication in collaboration with Dr. Sneha Kaur Choudhury is published by Routledge, UK in October 2024, very recent publication. And this book is titled Centering Women in Bollywood, Biopics, Empowerment and Agency in Contemporary Indian Cinema. So you see, this brief introduction obviously shows the wide, extensive range of her research interests. From Tagore on the one hand to Bollywood on the other, from the 18th century core British literature to other manifestations of cultural studies, the garden for example, these are fascinating areas of her research, of her scholarship. Today, she's going to talk to us about something very interesting that I'm sure is going to resonate with all of us here. She's going to talk about fairy tales, and not in a direct way, but in a very interesting take on fairy tales. But I don't want to spoil the moment, and instead of you listening to me, I would like to ask Professor Chakravarty to address you and to give us her talk today. Thank you.
Operate this. Yeah, I think it's on. Hello, hello. Thank you, Shubhita, for a very detailed introduction. I wanted you to keep it a little short, but you have taken all the pains to read out each and every book that or article that I've managed to write so far. And I thank Sister Nivedita University, the authorities, and especially Professor Shubhit Dhaur, the Dean of Humanities, for inviting me, for giving me this opportunity to share my thoughts with you. And it is also, doubly pleasing because this is a place where I can see some of my very favorite old students. So many of whom are quite closely connected with me. We get to interact because we have a center and these people participate in various events of the center. They attend the lectures. So that gives me a lot of pleasure. I presume I'm addressing UG, PG students and some scholars, right? Okay, so with that assumption, I have kept my lecture simple. I wanted to talk to you about my understanding of fairy tales. Let me tell you, although I write on different areas, but my core areas are of course gender, culture studies, and literature. I always consider literature to be a cultural artifact. So therefore, literature figures very prominently in the broader rubric, within the broader rubric that I work on. Right. My paper, as you can see, is titled Fractured versus Feminist Fairy Tales, Rereading Snow White and its 2012 Cinematic Revision. What do I really mean by this? Let me first give you my plan of presentation, my plan of the talk. It is divided into several sections. Well, I aim to bring out the difference between a fractured fairy tale, which is mostly read as a feminist tale, and a feminist fairy tale, given the fact that fairy tales are usually they're bearers of patriarchal, hegemonic ideologies prevalent in a particular society at a particular historical point, or the society that produced them. However, we should also keep in mind that there can be no original version of a fairy tale, because these tales are told and retold at different points in time, and they have always acted as conveys of predominant or dominant social values. So I shall begin by exploring the narrative design and also the framing and behavior of female bodies, gendered bodies, not just female bodies, but gendered bodies. In the original text, if we consider Little Snow White by Wilhelm and Jacob Grimm, especially the 1857 version, perhaps you know that there are two versions, 1812 and 1857 versions of Grimm's Little Snow White. The difference is that in the 1812 version, perhaps the mother, the queen mother, and the stepmother, the peddler woman, they are the same person. Whereas in the 1857 version, we have the introduction of the stepmother who enters the storyscape after the death of Snow White's mother, and then she plays all her malicious games. Now, so I will start first with a sort of a feminist critique or a reading of the original Snow White story. And then we will talk about a very recent version, comparatively recent, that is 2012 cinematic adaptation of the story by Hollywood, and this is titled Snow White and the Huntsman. Okay. And then of course I will try to, give you my understanding of what actually a true feminist fairy tale should be like. Okay. So there of course I will try to, give you the difference between a fractured fairy tale and a feminist fairy tale. Now I know that this is quite an ambitious task, but let me try. And I shall attempt to bring out the fundamental aspects, of the text in question to substantiate my argument that what we often experience as a feminist fairy tale is actually a fractured fairy tale. Okay. Now we all know that literature in general and fairy tales in particular gender children. The characters which are depicted in stories help children to determine what it means to be male or female as it applies to behavior, traits or occupation within a child's culture. Now in this capacity, fairy tales can be powerful cultural agents, and because they, often they define women as beautiful objects, powerless to alter the events in their own lives. While the men in the fairy tales are always powerful agents of their own destiny. There are characters within these tales who defy these descriptions. However, their defiance usually comes with a price because, and very often powerful women in fairy tales are depicted as, they are often, generally ugly, if not always evil. The exception to this rule is the wise woman or the fairy godmother, but then she is hardly human. She is not really a human being, the fairy godmother. So, traditional feminist criticism of the classic fairy tale texts, rests on the fact that stories that reflect these, the stories which reflect traditional patriarchal values, they usually survive, and those where these stereotypes are broken, they are forgotten, they sink into oblivion. So fairy tales therefore are told and retold, are not necessarily representative of the genre, but they are direct result of very strategic selection by the author or by the storyteller, who decides which are the elements to be kept and which are to be completely renounced. Okay. Now within this socio-political and historical perspective, the early feminists of the 1950s and 60s, they examined the roles of Shornendu. Where is Shornendu? You haven't switched off my phone. No, this is okay. No, this is actually the phone which is ringing. This is the second phone. Okay. Within this socio-political and historical perspective, early feminists of the 1950s and the 60s, they examined the roles of women who are embedded in the folk tales and the fairy tales, which have survived, of course, and found them, and I'm quoting from Andrea Dworkin, an unfortunate source of negative stereotypes and one of the many socializing forces that discourage females from realizing their full human potential. And I move on to this quotation from Dworkin. I read out, and you can also read it from the slide. There are two definitions of woman in fairy tales. There is a good woman, she is a victim. There is the bad woman, she must be destroyed. The good woman must be possessed, the bad woman must be killed or punished. Both must be nullified, and the ending of the tale tells us that happiness for a woman is to be passive, victimized, destroyed or asleep. Remember, passive, victimized, destroyed or asleep. It tells us that the happy ending is when we are ended, when we live without our lives or not at all. Okay. So during the late 70s and 80s, feminism of course evolved, conceptually embracing the fact that women were naturally separate from men and they were at least equal to men. And folk tales were consequently rewritten. Fairy tales were also rewritten, claiming to be feminist very often simply because they tended to reverse the normal gender roles. Now, one such example, I mean, there are several examples of these kinds of feminist fairy tales, the so-called feminist fairy tales like Lurie's Clever Gretchen and Other Forgotten Tales, and Phelps' The Maid of the North, Munch's The Paperback Princess. Now, where you find that traditional gender roles are reversed, simply reversed, there is no other change. For instance, in these tales, usually the strong, clever woman is actually paired with a stupid or an inept man. And they also began to show that there is a transition of feminist criticism towards the exploration of cultural diversity in these tales, and also the recovery of the collective female voice. Now, however, feminist fairy tales seem to lag several years behind the changing conceptions of feminism. As Jane Yolen lamented in her 1977 article, America's Cinderella, and I'm quoting, "The magic of the old tales has been falsified, the true meaning lost perhaps forever." However, this is something that the folklorists have decried as contamination, because there are several foreign influences, external elements which have been introduced to sort of pollute or contaminate the pure narrative tradition of the fairy tales. And this is something they have regarded as harmful, and also something that has falsified, that has harmed the essence of the purity and essence of the fairy tales. However, there are contesting, opposing views as well, and I should refer to the critic Jack Zipes, whose very famous work, Sticks and Stones, The Troublesome Success of Children's Literature from Slovenly Peter to Harry Potter, discusses the possibility that contamination in fairy tales can lead to, I'm quoting, birth of something unique and genuine in its own right. Although the European canon, usually headed by Grimm and Perrault, and are thought of as original fairy tales, there is, however, no genuine or authentic version, as Zipes reminds us. In fact, tales are constantly being revoked and adapted to reveal new facets of a culture or the creativity of an author or the storyteller. So, revision, re-vision, is necessarily a term which has been the groundwork for feminist post-culturalist, and it indicates the author's decision about what to retain and what to leave out in order to create a new vision of the text. So the simple reversal of gender roles does not result in the formation or in the creation of a feminist fairy tale, but rather a fractured fairy tale. And my example will be from Robert Munch's The Paperback Princess, where, of course, we have the princess, the heroine of the fairy tale, namely Princess Elizabeth, who saves Prince Ronald from a dragon, and she then refuses to marry him. Now, an extensive study was taken, and it was undertaken by Peggy S. Rice on the opinion, based on the opinion of 6th grade children, both boys and girls in America, who were very disappointed with Elizabeth. They could not accept Elizabeth as a typical fairy tale heroine. And they said that she should have cleaned up after the fight with the dragon and then married the princess. Okay, if you're interested, I'll just name the article. This is Gendered Readings of a Traditional Feminist Folktale by 6th grade boys and girls, and this came out in the Journal of Literary Research in 2000. Critics such as Brian Stum and Leslie Q. Kendall, they have also rightly pointed out that in order to truly revision a fairy tale and thereby create a work which can be artistically new and at the same time ring true to a child, the feminist authors must cease attempting to reverse gender roles simply. Okay. Let me now move on to the second part, where I shall be talking about, particularly about, a feminist reading. I should be giving you a feminist analysis of The Little Snow White by Jacob Grimm. And there my focus will be on how these stories are framed and how female bodies are shown to dominate or to reside in certain spaces, and what these spaces, how they sort of frame and shape the function of these bodies. And of course my focus will be on the stepmother, the evil stepmother, and on Snow White. Well, the point is that, as we know that when the Grimm brothers, they collected these tales from different oral sources, oral traditions, they made editorial judgments in regards to the stories, as contemporary retellings continue to do today. Therefore, the result is not a simple transcript of the oral tradition, but something new. Now, the idea that these stories are appropriate for children as a source of moral instruction began in the 19th century. However, on reading the Grimm's tales, one would realize that they are replete with, adult themes and also with adult situations. And there is actually enough murder, mayhem, anarchy, sexual innuendo in the brother Grimm's tales, which can of course give parents much pause. However, the very fact that these stories have been regarded, almost unflinchingly, unanimously regarded as very important for children, because they provide what Maria Tartar has called the hard facts of life. And therefore, they have been considered indispensable introduction to real life and adult responsibilities, now has been accepted by almost unanimously by all. So fairy tales, they are not so much about a fantasy world of childhood innocence as they are an initiation from the narrow confines of youth into the demands of maturity. From a feminist perspective, Snow White, Cinderella, and Sleeping Beauty as protagonists are victims of women who ultimately enforce domestic constraints on the allegedly innocent girl because they have been and are victims of patriarchy. Therefore, the older women help prepare the protagonists for marriage to a prince and then domesticity. Now, if this is the case, then it is logical to surmise that the young, innocent female protagonist, indoctrinated to the woes of a patriarchal society, will turn into a mother and witch. And she will also, in turn, victimize the next generation of young girls in order to maintain the status quo in society. Now, the physical elements of the spaces in which female bodies function in Little Snow White is our concern, and it helps us to influence, helps us to understand how these spaces, they influence and define the behaviors of female bodies. The queen, for instance, she uses certain frames and spaces to fragment her body. If you see how the way the queen appears before a dark ebony window, which partially makes her body visible. Her mirror is placed in a very secret chamber, a dark secret chamber, which is only accessible to the queen and to nobody else. And when she appears before the mirror, if you remember the story, and she stands before the mirror demanding to know that who is the fairest of all, it is predominantly her face which is visible. So most of the time we find, whenever the queen appears before us, it is a fragmented, truncated, vision of her body that is available. Whereas when Snow White appears when she is 7 years old, and after that, it is usually her whole body. And in a masculinist system, she remains protected, she is kept whole and complete, which seems to ensure her, dependence upon this system. A close study of the queen's stepmother peddler woman's body and his behavior in this tale reveal that she is not really motivated to kill Snow White because Snow White is simply beautiful, more beautiful than her. This is a rather, naive understanding of the situation. Why does she decide to kill Snow White? I personally feel that the queen, she does not desire beauty for its own sake. It is not just beauty for her for its own sake, but beauty for power and control. And therefore, you have to understand that both mother and daughter, they seem to be beautiful, but they're beautiful in very different ways. The queen is beautiful because, she does not conform to the societal, expectations, whereas the daughter is beautiful because she conforms to the ideals of society. Therefore, both the women, Queen and Snow White, cannot exist within the same frame, in the same landscape. One will have to die, or at least will have to appear dead. And that is what happens in Little Snow White. Now, the queen, she stands before the mirror, asking the mirror to tell her that, mirror, mirror on the wall, who in this land is fairest of all? To this the mirror answered, you, my queen, is the fairest of all. Now, the narrator tells us that the queen is beautiful, proud, and arrogant. Sort of, these qualities are then, they're used to define her, in a voice that is not her own. And it tries to objectify and stereotype her also as the wicked mother. However, when the queen wants a confirmation of her beauty, she doesn't ask the king, or for that matter, any other man present in her kingdom, to tell her whether she is beautiful or whether she is the fairest. But it is always the mirror. And you have to remember that this mirror is a possession of the queen. She possesses the mirror. It is therefore the mirror and a reflection, and the way she appears before the mirror, she doesn't appear before the mirror in a typical womanly fashion. She doesn't pimp her face or comb her hair or try to see how beautiful she is looking. But she maintains almost an emotionless, composed, still appearance as she appears straight before the mirror and demands to know who is the fairest of all. Now this, somehow, I feel it indicates how, how independent the queen is. She has agency, she has a mind of her own, and she is in complete control of her own emotions. She doesn't need the approbation of a man to say that she is the most beautiful, or perhaps the fairest of all creatures in the kingdom. Now the use of the word fairest is also very interesting, because fair is not really the synonym for beauty, beautiful. A fair woman is not a beautiful woman, but perhaps the word fair is, it perhaps, says that she has personal integrity, and her reputation again it can endure scrutiny. So, when Snow White appears, after her invisibility for 7 years, the queen thinks that she is her biggest contender, because somehow the Snow White possesses these qualities and she is much more desirable in a masculinist system than the independent, arrogant, proud queen. And therefore, the queen wants her to be removed. She wants her to be killed, and she appoints the huntsman. Now, the queen is more jealous because Snow White's pristine body has not yet reached reproductive maturity, and at the moment it cannot be distracted, pricked, or confined to domestic duty. However, the design of her body, the way the body appears in the text, it is presented in the text, suggests that eventually she will fulfill her domestic destiny. Therefore, her body will always be a complete body, and therefore it will always be visible. Consequently, Snow White she must be killed, obliterated from society, and the beautiful queen, therefore, as I said, as we all know, she appoints the huntsman to kill her. Now here the use of number 7 is also very interesting because Snow White appears before us when she is 7 years old. She crosses 7 mountains to reach the abode of the 7 dwarfs who nurture and take care of herself. So the word 7 is repeated again and again in the text, and the word 7 perhaps, it suggests completion or fullness. Snow White has to be complete, she will have to be trained for her actual, duties. The 7 dwarfs, remember, they are miners. They dig the bowel of the earth, the womb-like bowel of the earth for things that are very precious or valuable. Snow White's womb is not yet ready to perform its procreative function, but the dwarfs, they will train her for an indefinite period of time to make her suitable for a domestic function, for the prince to appear and claim her as her possession. Now, when the queen is almost surprised to know that Snow White is alive, she makes 3 attempts, very important attempts, interesting attempts. Now, the queen disguises herself as an old peddler woman, and the tools she uses for her attacks are also very interesting. Do you remember what are the tools that are used by the witch to kill Snow White? That is the last one. But there are 2 tools which she uses before that. The first one is a bodice, a dress that she has to wear. The second one is a comb. And you see, she's performing the exact function of a mother who dresses her child, takes care of her child, and feeds her child, and ultimately prepares her for her future life. So the queen, she uses a dress for Snow White to wear first. Snow White survives that attempt. She uses a poisonous comb to comb her hair. She also survives, and finally it is the poisoned apple which kind of sticks in her throat, and she apparently dies. Right. Now I will read out a quote from Laurie Baker Sperry and Lise Gorholz, who says that while the feminine beauty ideal is viewed largely as an oppressive patriarchal practice that objectifies, devalues, and subordinates, women, it is acknowledged that many women willingly engage in beauty rituals and perceive being or becoming beautiful as empowering, not oppressive. A further paradox of the feminine beauty ideal is that in a patriarchal system, those women who seek or gain power through their attractiveness are often those who are most dependent on men's resources. Therefore, the price that Snow White pays for being beautiful is objectification. She dies, but for 3 days, the dwarfs cannot bring themselves to bury her, and then when finally they decide to do something with her body, what do? They display her in a glass coffin, which displays her entire body. How she is presented in a reclined position. Her full body is visible, and she is absolutely asleep and voiceless. She doesn't move, she doesn't speak, and this is perhaps the ideal role that a woman should present in society. She'll be there to perform her duties, but she will have no agency, no autonomy of her own. So Snow White's body, unlike the queen's body, now that she is inside the coffin, will never be fragmented or dissected. Her body will not decay. It will remain fully exposed, reclined, voiceless, and passive, and communicate its willing compliance, of course, to patriarchal authority. And this further increases, the degree of her beauty. So, Snow White's beauty, therefore, which is an already, ideal feminine beauty, is enhanced inside the coffin by her death-like condition. In this form, she proves her complete and unequivocal submission to the desires and interests of the prince. Now, once the prince comes and sees Snow White, he is so attracted to her beauty that he carries the coffin with him. You know the story that the prince plants a kiss on her forehead and she comes back to life. This is not there in the original story. The original story says that the coffin is carried to his kingdom, and wherever the prince goes, the coffin follows him. His servants are made to carry the coffin with him. So symbolically, you know, Snow White, even when carried by servants, must follow the prince, except when he has a business outside the castle. Now, despite Snow White's condition, or perhaps because of her condition, the prince is very content or happy with her. And she doesn't talk, she doesn't question, she doesn't interact in any physical way. And she also spends, again, an unspecified amount of time confined in that small coffin. And she is constantly carried from here and there by the prince's servants. Now, of course, the servants are disgusted with this. They're very angry. And one day, you know, they break the coffin. They strike the back of Snow White. And then, because of the jerk, this poisoned apple, which was stuck in her throat, it comes out. And Snow White comes back to life. Now, true to her destiny, what does she do? You can imagine, she instantly walks to the prince. She doesn't question, she doesn't want to know where she is, why she is there. She immediately walks to the princess. Now, so this is what her domestic training under, you know, the tutelage of the dwarfs have actually taught her. He is overjoyed to see her, of course, and Snow White is, of course, ready to perform her domestic duties. Now, the queen, of course, is powerless here to resist the punishment which is exacted for her crimes. The queen must dance in red-hot iron shoes as a form of punishment for her non-compliance to society. And while she dances herself to death, everyone in attendance watches as she dies. Now, this death is not only the cause for the wedding day celebration, but it is again the best gift that the prince can give to Snow White. Now, there is no better way for the prince to ensure, you know, her complete and uncontested, you know, his complete and uncontested ownership of Snow White's body. So, this is how the story ends, with a promise of a happy life ever after, as it happens with all, you know, fairy tales. Now, from here, you know, let me move to the 2012 film Snow White and the Huntsman by Rupert Sanders. In fact, 2012 saw two Hollywood adaptations of the Snow White story. One is Mirror, Mirror, and the other one is Snow White and the Huntsman. Now, Mirror, Mirror is a comic, you know, reading of light, you know, very funny reading, while this particular film is replete with dark, mysterious images. When we read these, when we see this film, we find that the film retains almost all the main elements of the story, but add a kind of a feminist culture, a feminist cultural critique as a subtext. So, I shall present this film as an example of a fractured fairy tale which only succeeds in fracturing the strong patriarchal import of the classic story by adding certain new dimensions. The story introduces a dark witch. Now, these are some of the clips. You know, this is the typical royal castle of Tabor where Snow White's father resides. And as you can see, it's a Gothic medieval castle. That look is very much there. It is also isolated from the mainland. And then a dark, mysterious army attacks the kingdom. This is the mysterious army. And Ravenna enters the kingdom as a prisoner of war. Excuse me. She casts a spell on the king. On the nuptial night, she stabs the king to death, and then she becomes the queen. Now with Ravena's coronation, nature's beauty withers away. So that is how the film presents Ravena's influence on the kingdom. The film, however, adds a motive to Ravena's obsession for physical beauty. And this motive is to take revenge on men who have since time immemorial exploited women's beautiful body. So Ravena, what does she do to keep herself beautiful? And of course Snow White is in the prison. She appears before us not when she's 7 but when she's much older. Now this is what Ravena does. She hunts youth, young women, and she sucks youth from the body of young women very much like a vampire to keep herself eternally attractive and beautiful so that she can control men and resist patriarchal exploitation. The text then continues to base its narrative frame on the binary of good and bad woman. Ravena sees Snow White as her enemy because she is beautiful, pure and chaste. The evil queen wants her innocent heart to become, immortal. And she goes to the woods where Snow White finally resides with the huntsman in the disguise of a bird of prey, as she wants to snatch Snow White's heart. She feels that if she can consume Snow White's heart, then her youth will become eternal. She appoints Chris Hemsworth as the huntsman to look out for Snow White, but he ends up becoming her protector instead. Then Snow White, finally, she fights her battle with 2 men by her side, her childhood friend William and the huntsman, and eventually frees herself, her father's kingdom, from the clutch of Ravena. This is the hunter. The hunter kisses Snow White, and this brings her back to life. Snow White emerges as a fighter of people's cause. Her army invades. This is actually the army of the Duke's son, William, who invades Ravena's castle, and the last, face-off happens between Snow White and Ravena. And Ravena is defeated, then she burns in a fire and reveals a very old, decomposed body, indicating that she must have lived for ages on the lifeblood of other creatures or on the youth of other, sucked from other bodies. So finally, with Snow White's coronation, this is the scene of Snow White's coronation, and nature is once again restored. She becomes the queen with William by her side, and her emotional attachment to the huntsman also points to a future romantic relationship. So Snow White and the huntsman re-narrates the old story with a few twists. However, there are, of course, some truly feminist fairy tales which have been written, which revision the entire work and create something that is, from the ground up. And my example would be Donna Jo Napoli's works. She is one of the feminist authors who has found success in revisioning fairy tales and creating feminist rather than fractured fairy tales. And she has altered also the generic conventions in 3 main areas in her books that allowed her to rework the discursive foundations of the traditional material. Number 1, of course, narrative strategy. Number 2, representations of male and female characters. And thirdly, renegotiation of patriarchal ideologies. Now, Napoli chose narrative strategies that subvert the traditional omniscient anonymous narrator in order to present other sides of the story. And she frequently chooses a first-person narration or a narrator, allowing the protagonist to be the agent of his or her own narration. A female protagonist, as we know, is enabled whenever she narrates her own story. And in children's literature, the character's voice serves as a metaphor of female agency. providing her also with a potential or a power of self-determination. Now, I will refer to the Magic Circle by Nepali, which is a feminist revision of Hansel and Gretel. And in this story, Nepali makes a deliberate decision to give her sorceress protagonist, that is the traditional witch, voice and agency. Nepali's decisions regarding the sorceress invite the readers to empathize with a character who has not only been objectified and vilified in the traditional tales, but whose representation has more generally, been, I'm quoting, been symbolic of misogynist attitudes towards women. A truly feminist children's story has recently been defined as one in which the main character is empowered regardless of gender. In keeping with this definition, Nepali alters the representations of male and female characters with regard to issues of gender and gendered relationships. So this is sort of in a nutshell, the points where I've tried to jot down what actually makes a feminist fairy tale. Now, I would like to end this lecture by reading out a story which I do, which I can sort of, read in class with my students because it is very favorite. This is one of my favorite stories. And my students who are present here, they are familiar with this. This is a story by Margaret Atwood, a really short one, almost a 2-page story. And the story is titled, There Was Once. Now, in this story, we don't have a narration as such, but we have a dialogue between an anonymous storyteller and an anonymous listener. The storyteller can be perceived as a traditional storyteller, while the listener is, of course, a feminist listener who keeps on, intervening, interrupting the storyteller in order to change, the very narrative pattern of the story and also the way society sees, female protagonists or the fairy tale men and women. Now let me just read the story with you. This is a storytelling session or part of the whole presentation. It begins with the storyteller and the second voice will be the listener. There was once a poor girl, as beautiful as she was good, who lived with her wicked stepmother in a house in the forest. Forest? Forest is sparse, I mean. I have had it all with this wilderness stuff. It's not a right image of our society today. Let's have some urban for a change. There was once a poor girl, as beautiful as she was good, who lived with her wicked stepmother in a house in the suburbs. That's better. But I have to seriously query this word poor. But she was poor. Poor is relative. She lived in a house, didn't she? Yes. Then socio-economically speaking, she was not poor. But none of the money was hers. The whole point of the story is that the wicked stepmother makes her wear old clothes and sleep in the fireplace. Now you can understand that the intertext is Cinderella. Aha, they had a fireplace. With poor, let me tell you, there's no fireplace. Come down to the park, come to the subway stations after dark, come down to where they sleep in cardboard boxes, and I will show you poor. The storyteller begins again. There was once a middle-class girl, as beautiful as she was good. Stop right there. I think we can cut the beautiful, don't you? Women these days have to deal with too many intimidating physical role models as it is. What with those bimbos in the ads? Can't you make her, more average? And the storyteller begins again. There was once a girl who was a little overweight and whose front teeth stuck out, who I don't think it's nice to make fun of people's appearances. Plus you are encouraging anorexia. I wasn't making fun, I was just describing. Skip the description. Description oppresses. But you can say what color she was. What color? Black, white, red, brown, yellow. Those are the choices. And I'm telling you right now, I have had enough of white dominant culture this, dominant culture that. I don't know what color. Well, it would probably be your color, wouldn't it? But this is about me. It's about this girl. Everything is about you. Sounds to me you don't want to hear this story at all. Oh, well, go on. You could make her ethnic, that might help. The story begins again. There was once a girl of indeterminate descent, an average looking as she was good, who lived with her wicked, another thing, good and wicked. Don't you think you should transcend those puritanical, judgmental, moralistic epithets? I mean, so much of that is conditioning, isn't it? There was once a girl, as average looking as she was, well adjusted, who lived with her stepmother, who was not only very open and loving person because she herself had been abused in childhood. Better, but I'm so tired of negative female images. And stepmothers, they always get it in the neck. Change it to stepfather, why don't you? That would make more sense anyway, considering the bad behavior you're about to describe. And throw in some whips and chains. We all know what those twisted, repressed, middle-aged men are like. Hey, just a minute, I'm a middle-aged. Stuff it, Mr. Nosy Parker. Nobody asked you to stick in your oar, or whatever you want to call that thing. This is between the two of us. Go on. There was once a girl. How old was she? I don't know, she was young. This ends with a marriage, right? Well, not to blow the plot, but yes, then you can scratch the condescending, paternalistic terminology. It's woman, pal, woman. There was once. What this once? Enough of the dead past. Tell me about now. There, so what? So why not here? Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Chakravarty, for giving us a lecture which is not only insightful, but also which made us think a great deal. Fairy tales are there from our childhood, and fairy tales will be there when we will be there, I think, even when we pass away. Now, the way in which she read a fairy tale was, I think, not only fascinating, but it was something which was illuminating equally. Now, I personally found this lecture to be an amazing one, and so thank you so much for being with us. Now, I'm sure there would be questions, interrogations, agreements, or even better, disagreements. So, any responses from the floor, from the people, from the students here, or from the faculty here?
Anyone have any questions? Come on, fairy tales.
My students can also ask questions, you know. They don't have to be nice to me. I'm willing to answer anything. I'm sort of, respond to anything, not really answer. So those who have questions can.
Yes.
Yes, please. Good afternoon. You take a mic, I can't hear you.
Ma'am, can we say that there is a constant clash between two intrinsic values, like one of Queen Ravina, whose values are not validated by society, whereas for Snow White, her values are validated by society?
Exactly. Absolutely right. Her values meaning the way she is presented as an ideal woman. You see, when Ravina ascends the throne, nature withers away. Because Ravina uses her beauty to avoid control over her body and mind, and she asserts her independence. Okay, if a feminist, if I try to use a feminist lens to read these texts. But in case of Snow White, she she is also independent because she fights her own battle, recovers her father's kingdom, but she always does it with the help of the men who kind of
He's
sort of,
always aided by
accompany
the
her.
society.
Because the army which actually recovers Tabor is the army of the Duke, whose son is the Duke, who was the father of the queens, of the king, and whose son is William. Right, so yes, there is a juxtaposition of two different values. Something that makes a woman more desirable and what doesn't make a woman desirable. So these, if the woman, she possesses qualities which are not so desirable or ideal for, society, then of course she will have to become a bad person or a witch for that matter.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.
Yes. In fact, this is a very common thing. Whenever you talk about witches, if you read the 15th and 16th century stories of witch hunting and when they were burned alive, or these stories usually they target women who were independent, who were alone. They lived independently on their own terms. They were usually branded as witches. We really don't know whether all of them knew black art, but any woman who defied patriarchal control was very often branded as a witch. আমাদের এখানেও হয়। আমরা হয়তো কিছুদিন আগেও আমরা যদি দেখে থাকি যে খুব গ্রামে গঞ্জে যে একটু খুব পাওয়ারফুল মহিলা হলে তাকে কিন্তু গ্রামের লোকেরা অনেক সময় তাকে ডাইনি বলে, হ্যাঁ, ডাইনি বলে সম্বোধন করে। সবাই যে ব্ল্যাক আর্ট জানে সেরকম নাও হতে পারে। তাহলে এটা কমন একটা জিনিস, এই বাইনারিটা খুব কমন।
থ্যাংক ইউ ম্যাম।
Yes.
I don't think it will classify as a question related to this topic, but nowadays on the internet, if you open Instagram or any other social media platform, you see a lot of men speaking about how they should be, how masculinity should be, I can't remember the exact word, should be earned and femininity should be protected, and they
speak about how masculinity should be
earned and femininity should be protected. And does it come from the background of fairy tales, like how men go out and save women?
Fairy tales, they are used for socialization. Just what I said at the beginning of the lecture, that they have a very important didactic role to play. They tell children what is right, what is wrong, what is good, what is bad, and this is the way how they condition the child's mind. So even men, they are also a part of the socializing process of fairy tales, because men are also taught to be, they are set to be something like a Prince Charming. So it's not that the fairy tales only condition women, but they also condition men. And create, mutual expectations. A woman looks up to her hero or her lover to conform to certain traits, and vice versa.
That was my question.
So we haven't really improved. We haven't become modern. We are still in the good old days. That's what your question, points to.
Okay. Do you have any more questions?
I do see a lot of toxic masculinity nowadays. Men really don't always want to protect women. There is a lot of toxicity, especially when it comes to social media.
Thank you, ma'am.
Okay, do you have any more questions? I guess not. Okay, so thank you so much everyone for turning up for yet another insightful session of Saturday with a Scholar. I would like to thank ma'am for giving such valuable insights, and I'm sure we will see you guys in the next one, in the third episode of Saturday with a Scholar. Thank you so much. Thank you.